really important workshop, Language, Region, Knowledge, Colonial Disciplines to Indian Social Sciences. And Veena has been organizing workshops along these themes for quite some time, which is a really significant aspect of the kind of diversity that IEG sociology has. It's also of interest to me personally in terms of research as a sociologist. I'm not going to say very much more except that thank you for coming. And I look forward to all the papers, as many papers I can attend, given the diversity, the regional diversity that's represented here in terms of language politics, and particularly in terms of social sciences, which in the current time affects and concerns all of us in terms of what's happening to social sciences, what the future direction should be, and the really problematic relationship between, say, the English language in social sciences and the non-English language in social sciences. That's really at the, I think, really at the heart of at least the non-economic social sciences in India, the relationship between the English languages and the non-English languages. So thank you for coming, and I now hand it over to Elvira for further comments. Thank you.
Welcome to all of you from my side as well. My name is Elvira Graner. I'm the Deputy Director of this Center of Advanced Studies. It's a project or a network funded by the German government, and IEG, with both Sanjay, Srivastava and Veena Naregal, is one of the core institutional partners along with CSDS, and luckily we do have several colleagues from CSDS both today and tomorrow as well. The third partner in this network from the Indian side is CSSS in Kolkata. On the German side, it's the Max Weber Foundation, it's the University of Erfurt, the University of Göttingen, and the University of Würzburg. So it's a project funded by the German government, which will hopefully have a 10-year span altogether. We are in just at the end of the second year, quite busy sort of writing both the reports and applying for the next sort of set of funds, but hopefully all of us will manage to do so. Sanjay Srivastava from the Indian side is the Indian director. There's one German director, Martin Fuchs. Now with that, I hand over to Neeladari, who will give you a brief introduction. Within this network, there are 6 thematical themes, one being called History as a Political Category, and he'll briefly elaborate on that.
Yeah. As already mentioned, there are several modules within this ICAS project on metamorphosis of the political. The idea being to look at the way politics is connected to the constitution of democracy, of rights, discourses of development, identity politics, etc. Within these modules, there is one module under which this conference is workshop is being held, which is history as a political category. Just a few words about the way this module was visualized, so that one can think of the papers and ideas in a way that links up with the module in some sense. The general assumption when the module was being debated and discussed is that in 20th century and even before, the politics of power in a variety of forms is inevitably always mediated by writing of history. And in some sense, political interpretations of history then constitute the way politics unfolds over time. So if politics helps the constitution of identities, the battle over identities is played out at the site of history very often. You rewrite history, you question history, you question hegemonic interpretations, and this is something which we see as played out at all levels and at different sites. 4 broad themes were identified within this. One was the way politics is played out at the level of the region and the nation, and practices of spatialization and territorialization get linked to the writing of history. That is, the making of nation states, we know, required in many forms a subordination of the region and the local to the nation, and the writing of a history in a way which legitimated the constitution of the nation. So constitution of the nation state inevitably also is linked up with the writing of nationalist histories. Conversely, the making of the region or localities at different levels inevitably question the meta-narrative of the nation and write the regions and rewrite their histories in order to offer a different way of imagining the spaces around, either by locating themselves within the nation or defining an alternative way of imagining spaces and territorializing the space. So in what way does history get linked in this battle for identities and reworking of spaces and territories? That's one of the themes being discussed. Second is a broader theme of the relationship between constitution of racial and ethnic identities with the writing of history. Race relationships all over the world, and we are not talking of India here, it is an international project. The writing of history has been critical to the constitution of race, and questioning of race has got linked up with a politics of deracializing history. So how does race and history get connected? What are the kinds of connections, and how does history, the professional history, also reflects how is race written into history and how is race questioned within professional history? That's something which this theme will be debating and discussing over time. The third theme was the theme of a theme which focused on oppressed and marginalized communities. We know that the identities of marginalized communities and groups, the battle for identities is linked up with a battle for an alternative history. The effort has often been to write a history which is then seen as authentic and authorized by the communities and groups, oppressed and marginalized groups, and there's a demand for recognition of that history. There's a demand that this history be recognized by the hegemonic groups and elites within the country, and the marginalized groups are given a space within the professional histories of the country. But alternatively, there is also a demand that their version of the history is seen as the authentic version of history. Now, what is implied, what is the implication of all this for the writing of history, and how we need to relate to these histories is something we need to debate and discuss. That is, we have to take these histories seriously and define a particular form of think about how to both acknowledge those histories and relate to those histories. And finally, there's been a wider discussion of how to think about Adivasis, Aboriginals and others, and the writing of histories which bring them into the mainstream of history, which writes the Adivasi into history in a certain sense. Their identity politics, again, is linked up with rewriting and writings of history. So within these four themes, and through these four themes, we hope to think about the entanglement of history with politics of identity, politics of space, politics of territorialization, politics of race. So at one level, one will be focusing on the variety of popular, plebeian, subaltern, marginalized histories which need to be understood, studied, thought about, and written about. At another level, we hope to see how professional histories engage with these histories at different levels, and what is the implication of these entanglements. And at a third level, how is politics of our time defined by the writing and rewriting of these histories? So what are the ways in which these intimate connection between politics and history writing is established, and what are the implications of those that co-constitution of these? Now, the conference, as I can see it, is expanding the scope of this idea to integrate not just history as a theme of study, but also the constitution of discipline, other disciplines in the making of regions, identities, communities, groups, languages. All I can say is that what we need to think about is the fact that one needs to connect back these discussions to the writing of history in some sense. It shouldn't be just a discussion of the making of the region and the politics of language, but how they impinge on the writing on history and how history confronts the politics of region, language, and ethnicities. I'll stop there.
I'll just begin by saying a very warm welcome to all our participants and everybody who has made it to the workshop. I'll just take a few minutes to say a little bit about the sort of the broad design of how we thought of the sessions for this workshop. I would also like to sort of, I'll try and highlight how the themes of the workshop also connect with the broader mandate of the of ICAS to think about the metamorphosis of the political. In whatever I say here, I'll broadly draw upon the concept note which was shared with the participants, but that's also a way to actually then put all those issues on the table for all of us who will be here both today and tomorrow. This workshop seeks to historicize the political through thematizing the politics of knowledge vis-a-vis the Indian social sciences across a key juncture in the making of Indian democracy. From the Bengal partition of 1905 onwards, concerns about territorial reorganization in colonial India got articulated in tandem with political reform towards a more representative administration. Significantly, however, concrete moves towards limited avenues of self-government at the provincial levels saw territorial reorganization being rapidly linked up to the possibility of linguistic provinces. What did this mean? Most strikingly, within a polyglot polity characterized by immense linguistic diversity such as ours, a direct identification between region and a singular linguistic identity. In other words, a single language being identified as a marker of regional identity, as was clearly institutionally indexed through the reorganization of the Congress in 1920. These moves towards a direct identification between region and single languages within the context of huge linguistic diversity seems peculiarly incongruous. And yet, colonial and nationalist viewpoints were agreed in presenting linguistic provinces as primarily intended to further democratic intentions, as indeed synonymous with governance in keeping with popular interests through the language of the people. Evidently, the legitimacy of the first political reforms towards provincial self-government was implicitly yet strongly premised upon the territorialization of the language issue. Secondly, such maneuvers to define representative structures and territorial demarcations, the decades spanning the late colonial period and the early years after independence also saw a simultaneous expansion of the university network and the institutionalization of the social sciences in the university curriculum. So you literally had these two sets of processes happening side by side at the same juncture. In mapping the metamorphosis of the political then, the core question being posed here is to ask how the linking of territory, language, and representative structures impinged upon the shape of the social sciences at their emergent juncture within the colonial university system, colonial Indian university system. Moving further, even as the contours of the regional within the Indian nation space were being worked out, this imaginary of linguistic territorial entities rapidly and simultaneously lent itself to be tellingly recast as a target of an ahistorical developmental vision. Thus, while the embracing of developmental agendas was prefaced by a full and formal political acquiescence to the logic of linguistic territorialization, actual linguistic reorganization of states had to wait till 1960, a whole decade after economic planning became the centerpiece of the national mission. How indeed may we historically unpack the intellectual implications of these political conceptual shifts? In particular, what implications did these shifts have in the choice of paradigms, formulation of agendas, and methodological orientations of emerging knowledge forms vis-a-vis the Indian social sciences? So against this sort of broad canvas, let me just extract a few themes that I think are at the core of this workshop. As we know, the historical antecedents of the Indian social sciences lie in the vernacular public domain and the simultaneous rise of the region as a political, linguistic, and cultural formation from the late 19th century onwards. In other words, the Indian social science enterprise derived its legitimacy from its complex allegiances with the vernacular realm. A word about the sequence in which the disciplines emerge in the colonial university system. Propelled by the imperative to frame the possibility of knowledge for and of the nation, vis-a-vis the emerging dynamic of the nation/region, history and literature emerged as the key disciplines in the decades leading up to independence. Through this period, a limited study of political economy had formed a part of the undergraduate history curriculum, even as history and literature, as the disciplines of prestige, took on the challenges of producing canonical narratives of national and regional pasts. Significantly, the limited provisions for responsible government through political reforms of 1919 that we spoke about saw a transfer of education to provincial legislatures. Interestingly, this juncture saw the gradual reintroduction of vernaculars into university curricula after a lapse of nearly 6 decades, but now as separate literary disciplines that could be pursued for specialized study, while you also separately saw the first efforts to institute the social sciences as specialized disciplines beyond the BA level. So this kind of a bifurcation between the study of the vernaculars and the disciplines happening at this key juncture of 1919 onwards, the moment of limited political reform and the beginnings of sort of self-government, the moves towards self-government. How did these decisions about the separation of the vernacular languages from the social sciences, social science disciplines stem from and in turn complicate the politically charged emerging imaginary of linguistic territories and the region? After 47, in consonance with the trajectories delineated above, displacing the preeminence of history and literature, development economics, a subfield of the discipline of economics, emerged as the key field in defining intellectual agendas post-47. This linking of disciplinary agendas to the concerns and paradigms of development economics had major implications. Increasingly, the regional one sees within the Indian social sciences was deployed as a category that was synonymous with the selective management of the flow of power, economic resources, or cultural patronage between the center and the states of the Indian Union. How may we interrogate then this paring down post-47 of the regional and its further separation from the vernacular within higher education discourse. So to try and capture in a nutshell the question before us, how may we explore and thematize the implications for the political of this historically driven attenuation of the partnership between the regional, academic, and vernacular realms, both in relation to the legitimative discourses around linguistic provinces and developmentalism. To carry forward a discussion that engages with this canvas of issues, the workshop has been structured, as you can see from your program, around sessions and papers on a range of intersecting themes. As indicated in your program, I'm just going to sort of conclude my remarks right now by mentioning our session themes, which include polyglot polities, unilingual regions, vernacular to regional early disciplinary junctures, nomadic languages, bounded frameworks, academic versus vernacular, higher education debates after 47, economics in the vernacular, disciplinary agendas before 1947, and the final session, between region and the national, recuperating the local. You will notice that our session titles indicate that we are not going to sort of, we cannot proceed in this discussion in any sort of simplistic chronological fashion. We will have to work cutting back and forth across time spans. And the presence of our chairpersons, who will also actively provide comments and draw out connections between the sessions and the broader thematic, and the final concluding session that we have tomorrow, where we have a brilliant closing panel, and I would like to thank both Uday Kumar, who is not yet here. He's going to sort of join us around lunch, and Thma Banerjee. These will also, both these colleagues are going to be part of the closing panel, and I look forward to both the discussions that are going to ensue as part of the sessions and the discussions that will ensue, towards the close tomorrow. And I'm looking forward to a really exciting workshop. Thanks again to all of you for coming, and I'd like to now hand over to go over straight to the first session, which Ravi Vasudevan